Welcome to our next research seminar. I think this is the third one in the series, and funded by Oticon, so we're always very grateful to get the funding. I think the room is slightly warmer than it was last week. It was really cold when we were here last week. So, but Michael had told Bill, and he's got an extra jersey. We're never as cold as Glasgow. So welcome. This is Dr. William Whitmer, Bill, who is a researcher for the Institute of Hearing Research in the Scottish section based up in Glasgow. So that's a section that is run by someone called Michael Aykroyd. And there's a group of researchers up there doing very good work on, I suppose it comes under the heading of impairment and disability. Yep. So Bill's been there for a number of years now, about 5 or 6 years? 5.5 years. And he publishes in the journals that most of us that are working in audiology or hearing science would be reading. So this year he's had articles in Ear and Hearing and International Journal of Audiology, Journal of Acoustical Society. I'm coming to that one.
Thanks for that.
And JAZA. But actually the topic we're going to hear about today I think is not something you published yet.
No.
Okay. So Bill's going to be telling us today a bit about signal to noise ratio and what are meaningful differences for people in real life. So we spend a lot of time doing clinical trials, and we set our test and we measure the performance of a particular signal to noise ratio, and then we see does this different device or whatever change the signal to noise ratio. And if it does by a dB or two, we get very excited and get statistically significant results. But the question really is, well, what are the implications for the patient or the user of a hearing instrument? Does it matter to them? So that's what Bill's going to be talking about today. He occasionally drops some Glasgow words into his presentation, so if he does it, I'll decipher for you. Things like, I didn't ken what you mean, I think it might crop up this one, it cropped up in a previous one. But anyway, Bill.
Thanks so much everyone for coming. And yes, going to talk about signal to noise ratio and trying to get beyond, it's often used as a basic measure of speech intelligibility. What sort of speech versus noise ratio can you understand the speech, and how it can be improved, and especially with hearing aids, which we're very much interested in. I just want to mention the fellow right there, that's David McShefferty. He did a lot of the grunt work on this. So if there's anything good about it, it's probably David's doing, and if there's anything wrong, it's probably mine. Basic questions we have is that speech intelligibility benefit a positive change in the signal to noise ratio meaningful if you can't even detect it? And if you could then detect it, how much actual subjective value, how much meaning, as we should say, would you actually give to that SNR change? Basically the idea is and this will be our basic model, is we present a sound to someone at a certain signal to noise ratio, and then we apply an improvement. We take down the noise, boost the speech a little bit, give a little change, positive change in that signal to noise ratio, and say, was that worthwhile? Are you motivated by that? So we take a look at that. And this actually came originally from a question based on, in Glasgow, we have Stuart Gatehouse's files. And Brian Moore came up and said, did Stuart ever do any sort of just noticeable differences in SNR? No. We started looking around, and it didn't seem many people had. We'll get to that in a moment. But we started thinking about what does a change in speech intelligibility actually mean? And what we started with is this sort of idea, because you see a presentation and you'll see brochures from companies and say, we provide so much gain, we provide this much benefit. And it's like, but what does that actually sound like in a way? Here, let's try something. See if this works. Here is performance, and basically what I'm doing is applying what's called expansion. I'm just dropping out the low level information of the sound. So this would be someone performing at 45%.
On the same day, it was given out that fresh documents had been discovered.
And then they suddenly do 10% better. They're getting 10% more information.
On the same day, it was given out that fresh documents had been discovered.
Different? Much better? But then let's try a different passage, and now someone was only getting 25%,
which revealed further peaks about snow,
versus 50% change.
which revealed further details about snowballs contributing to the joke.
Aha, snowball. Anybody recognize the passage? The book? Anyone know? Snowball? Complicity with Jones? Oh. Animal Farm. Animal Farm. A fun read. So, but we deal with signal to noise ratio often, instead of this idea of trying to expansion circuit. So let's take a look at just a couple of those, and just the idea of having 1 dB of benefit.
Quench your thirst, bend the crackers. Quench your thirst, bend the crackers.
Now that's at 0 dB SNR and boosting up to 1. Were those actually different? Were those profoundly different? Were those different enough for some reason? And now let's look at a different
Quench your thirst, bend the crackers.
Most of us are probably a bit normal hearing, so this is actually probably easy to understand the sentence. And so that it can actually add into it. But let's try this. Okay, let's try that again, now that I've talked.
Quench your thirst, bend the crackers.
Versus this.
Quench your thirst, bend the crackers.
And so the idea of the dramatic difference, hopefully you hear between that 1 dB versus this 5 dB change. And would that be motivational to someone? Now, some of you probably haven't dealt with the signal to noise ratio and how it's measured. And one of the crudest ways, and in fact this is the way it's often done, is just based on the root mean square power of the whole signal. So here's the sentence here: quench your thirst, then eat the crackers. Always good advice. And basically we take as the whole sum of the energy there, and we come out and say, that's presented at 75 dB. But as you notice, there's quite a few dips in the power there as you go along. And so what we call, and what we'll be talking about as being SNR 6 dB, positive 6 dB SNR, is the fact that here's the noise in red behind the signal now in green. And you notice that there's these dips and points in it where it actually is much lower, the ratio is much lower, negative SNR. But overall, because of these peaks in it, it has maintained what's called a 6 dB SNR and RMS. We'll get to this at the end of the talk as a point of discussion. But I just want to point, if you did it in what's called a segmental version, and you take a 20 millisecond window and you start analyzing it, and you start looking at the levels of the signal, which are, I don't know if you can tell, those are the green dots versus the red. The red dots are the ones that basically stay relatively static. And as Dr. Stone will tell you, that's actually not that static, as the noise itself has in with each little window level fluctuations or envelope fluctuations that can give clues. But you see the level of the speech is very wildly in these 20 millisecond windows. And so what you get in what's called a segmental signal to noise ratio is a very wide scatter as opposed to the 6 dB SNR. Giving you this to basically put the critical cap on as we go along, because we will be talking about RMS in a 2-second window. The point being, as we think about it, is when we listen, do we actually take things in as a whole on these sort of more 2-second chunks, or are we taking the sounds in and appreciating the benefits on a larger scale? But our first question is a change in SNR meaningful if it cannot be reliably detected? Basically, that comes down to what is the J&D in SNR? And so what we've done is design a test. But before you design the test, you look through the literature and you go through, we try to find something. And as I mentioned at the start, we tried to find previous evidence of an SNR and J&D. And we found but one, this G. Gordon Liddy impersonator, Meade Killian, a mad genius, had done in basically his trade journal, had a short little paragraph talking about how he could use his quicksand corpus, his product, to look at, basically he was talking about directional benefit for a hearing aid microphone, but how much benefit could they detect in directional benefit? And so he had this seemingly simple little idea and found listeners performing at chance for about 2 decibels of a change in SNR. But he never really specified any of his methods or more about his results in any way. It was just this sort of idea. 2 decibels at chance. But that was the smallest increment he used, so it's really hard to say if it actually could have been lower or not. There's a lot of fudge going on there. Fudge, the nice word. So what we did is we went to level discrimination tests, and there's a long history of literature on that, and used what's called the standard pedestal and increment. You have a certain level, and then you change it by a certain increment, and you look at what's the smallest increment that you can detect, the smallest change, the smallest delta SNR. And so we did that with both an adaptive, so we adaptively adjusted this delta SNR, and in a fixed level, where we present certain variations in delta SNR multiple times. So it doesn't track you along like the audiogram. You just present it random, all these different ones, and then look at which one corresponds to chance or a certain performance. So we used male talker IEEE sentences, just like that, quench your thirst and then eat the crackers. The same sentence in each trial, so in each pair. Then we generated some noise based on that corpus. We used two different reference SNRs, a 0 and a +6 dB. So basically something where, especially for a hearing impaired, it should be rather difficult, and something where it should be rather easy. The interesting point here is that most noise reduction schemes work well at +6 and start to fail at 0. Most sort of algorithms have a hard time, and especially when you get into a negative SNR, they start to fail because they can't find the signal anymore themselves based on the acoustic signal. So that's why we chose 0 and 6. And then we varied this, as I mentioned, both adaptively, taking it down until someone got the answer wrong, get it right, get the answer wrong, find that nice point there, or just presented a plethora of different SNRs and see which ones they got wrong and right as well. Take all that, we get our two intervals, and we rove the levels then of those two intervals, because if you just took this and added this would have a level cue to it, and we don't want people to learn that. So to avoid that, to rove the level, it does make the test more difficult, which might be inflating our results in a bit, but we checked that as well and found it only affected it a slight bit. But we do rove it, and so they're just focusing, comparing the mixture of signal and noise in each one of the intervals, and then comparing across, and we ask them which sentence was clearer. The basic question. We do explain to them that this question revolves around comparing these two. And there's the real gist of it for all you lovers of psychophysics. We did it as a 3 down, 1 up. So you got 3 right, it got harder, 1 wrong, it got easier. And that gets you, estimate actually 79%. We started rather easily at a delta SNR of 12 dB between the two intervals. We used multiplicative step sizes to decrease down since we're dealing with levels. And then we computed the mean geometrically because we're using these multiplicative steps. Like I said, this is all for the psychophysical lovers out there. Anyone? Lovers? Yes! Excellent. I'm not speaking alone then. And then we took the average of the best 2 or 3 thresholds. We did some analyses on how to work at this, and sometimes because some of these adaptive tracks were a bit long, you started to notice there were some really errant thresholds. And it found the best thing to do was do the best 2 out of 3 really got us down to a nice pool of variance. Whereas you find somebody just, oh, what? And then suddenly their adaptive track is gone. So that worked out well. And then for the fixed level, we just ran a bunch of delta SNRs from 0.5 dB up to 8 dB, 40 trials at each one of those to get a relatively good mean. And then just use 0 dB only, just because of time. These are the sort of folks we had from the audiology clinics. Pretty standard, sort of minor moderate. We had some few normal people, and they rather ran the gamut across here. Most of the folks were older. We had a few younger folks. That's the mean plus deviations. And that's about it for that. And this is what we found. Level discrimination is about 1 dB or less. It could be a bit more than 1 dB depending on the stimulus you use and the style of thing. But here we found that the SNR differences. We're all around 3 decibels. And here it shows the fixed level results, where we determine, we put curve fits to these people's data based on the SNR, and that's where you come up with, let's find, the adaptive, remember, was estimating 79%, so we find the 79%, and we take that, and we take the average there, 3.2. We had a couple of people who did rather poorly in the fix, we take them out, and we actually did an exact match to our adaptive. So we're actually corroborating through different methods, something around 3 decibels. And to take a look at the individual data across the adaptive and fixed, as a function of age, there is a slight significant correlation showing that the scatter does start to go up, that the SNR J&D does rise with age, showing that there is a difficulty in this test. You're doing this simultaneous comparison of signal and noise and then a sequential, comparing these 2 intervals. So there's a difficulty to it, and some of the older folks did have some difficulty with it, and there's sort of 2 outliers. But interestingly, it didn't have much to do with the better ear 4 frequency average here, plotted with SNR J&D plotted a function of that for all of the listeners. And we don't see anything there, which means possibly that people are all using the same strategy of looking at those peak parts. So ignoring when we're talking about how the segmental SNRs, there's a lot of bits where there's quiet in the sense. They're not focused on that at all. They're focused at the peak bits in the speech and comparing that with the signal. And that's what we did. It's there. And as I mentioned before, it's the first time I've had a scatter plot that actually looks like a continent. So there's Australia. But the important thing for this first bit is we seem to have a pretty solid 3 dB SNR J&D based on this method. So what does that mean? Like I said, it's much more than a level J&D of 1 dB. There's an increase, there should be an increase in the J&D of doing this difficulty, simultaneous and then a sequential comparison, and the fact that you're actually grabbing parts of the speech, you know, little bits of it, but still, those bits add up to a reasonable duration that you wouldn't expect such an increase based on that from just normal level of discrimination. And now, the limits of this is just this one corpus and this one set of noise. In this one method, we'll use 2 different procedures, but basically a similar method. And now, if you had perhaps a different noise, would it lower? Possibly. But what's interesting to us is if people are actually just looking at the peaks, those peaks are actually at a higher than the RMS standard. Remember I was talking about how we compute this RMS J&D? The peaks are at a higher, so people are actually, the SNR J&D is actually an underestimate then of what they're actually doing. And if you consider that in real life you have multiple distractors, echoes, things of that sort, it actually could be worse. J&D could be higher. And so from just this point in my talk, you could think that the hearing aid or some sort of intervention is going to have to deliver a lot to give somebody a wow, much more than 3 decibels of SNR benefit for them to go, oh, I noticed that. That was, you know, repeat it many times, they might notice something like that, but you'd have to do it. Give much more than 3. But that's just the J&D. We want to know about meaning. But how best to test if this SNR J&D is meaningful? General health instruments, questionnaires, surveys like that often fail when it comes to hearing. Kevin and I were just discussing how quality of life adjusted years, or quality adjusted life years, qualies,
Yeah.
not qualies, qualies. How they don't really register hearing difficulties and changes in hearing difficulties from mild to profound hearing loss, for example. We need something else. Most established means within health psychology and health economy, which are trade-offs, these discrete choices, often don't suffice because often the baseline is death. It's often an intervention where it's like, well, we remove the tumor or we don't. We don't remove the tumor. SNR change is not going to register on something like that. what we need to do is somehow limit and fence in the inquiry to hearing. And what came up was the idea of this, with the SNR change, and in the clinic setting, we need to have a wow. You need to be able to present something. So why not just use our same SNR J&D method setup of having these two intervals, one with slightly better SNR, and see if anyone ascribes to that any sort of value. They say, yeah, that was worthwhile subjectively. So we didn't know exactly, to be honest, how to go about best doing that. So we tried several different ways. We borrowed a listening ease, where you give a rating of how the ease of listening of a certain situation. We tried what we call conversation tolerance. We get that more, where you basically get the number of conversations you tolerate. Would you swap a device for another? That's a very classic sort of health business model to use. And then what we'll put quotes around the clinical significance, because there is something called a clinically significant or clinically important difference. That in health is basically, if you want to take 5% of the population and you, or you have 10% with this issue and you want to reduce it to 5%. It doesn't really correspond, once again, to the field we're in. So what we talk about clinical significance is, would you go to the clinic for this change? We take it very literally in that sort of regard. And in the end, to peel it all the way back to its basic layer, we do just a simple rating. Play the SNR, play the higher SNR, or in the opposite order, and ask, was that better or worse? Now, to give you a sense of how to think about and analyze, you're going to see a bunch of results here. It's like, on these subjective reports, do they relate to the SNR J&D? Well, if they don't relate to anything, people are just meh. You're just going to see a subjective report, perhaps on the scale, and it'll just not change the function of that change in SNR. If it's about the intelligibility and their performance, you'd expect it to be a nice linear slope, to just continue on increasing as a change in SNR, as you'd expect their performance on some speech reception task to go up. But if we hypothesize that if it has something to do with the SNR J&D, you should see something more of a broken stick, where somewhere around the SNR J&D or somewhere, there'll be a shift in responses, where they go, aha, I detect it, therefore I like it. Or, I find it worthwhile. Now there's also the issue that we'll have with some of these, and goes with almost any questionnaires or surveys you do. What does 1 unit mean for often of these? And we'll try to avoid this by going to something where it's just a simple yes-no, where then you look at 50%. If you're above that, you're probably doing well. So the first two we did is this ease of listening. So you play them a sentence in the noise that is given SNR, and then at the benefit, and yes for both of them. Was that a difficult or easy situation? And you just look at the difference between the two. Conversation tolerance, we also look at a difference, but we ask them, we play the situation and say, this is a scenario you have for an evening. You have at least 8 people that want to talk to you. How many would you be willing to talk to that evening? Alex McPherson in our lab came up with this idea. And so we look at the difference between those two. At least there we know what 1 means. 1 is 1 further conversation in the evening. So that's kind of nice, as opposed to here where, 5 is so-so, 6 is so-so? Don't really know. But what we get is basically the answers to both were about the same. And what we see is kind of a combination of our hypotheses in a way. We do see this rather linear increase with delta SNR, both for the number of conversations, for the delta SNR plus a certain delta, and then for the listening ease question, the same sort of difference. We get this nice general increase. But thing to notice is that they don't really start getting off the ground until much later. There's not this large jump. And here we've put in where the 3 dB SNR is, and they're still basically at 1 unit, 1 conversation, or 1 unit of the listening ease scale, before they don't get above it until well into 6 or 8 dB. It's rather interesting. But that just resolved these questions, these sort of ideas, these questionnaire issues that I talked about in the last slide. What does all this mean? So then we looked to much more general applied sort of questions. In the swap one, would you swap your current device for a different one? Making sure to use different. As Piers has shown, and actually several others have, there's a lot that happens when you suddenly say this is new. There's this effect that goes along and people are dumbly ascribed to it. So if you said here's one and here's a new one, we might expect a bias already in that sort of response. And so here we just play, here's your current device and here's a different device. Would you change for it? And we also asked some general questions on their hearing health and their general hearing and hearing aid use to try to correspond to that. What we found, similar to that previous, is as a function of the change in SNR, the proportion of times someone said, yes, I'd swap it, does increase, but doesn't really get above chance until, say, 6 dB, and doesn't actually, for an advantageous SNR, here we've switched to -6 and +6 to really start trying to push those sorts of differences, starting from a difficult situation to a less difficult, or starting from easy into more easy. And so, and what you get is what you sort of expect for more easy. There's less motivation to swap. For more difficult, there is the more motivation to swap over, at least early, with less benefit. But once again, 6 dB, quite a bit, even quite a bit more than the SNR J&D. Now those questionnaires, there was a rather small correlation with people's general quality of life on the day for those who had tried hearing aids, but not with hearing aid benefits. So a bit frustrating there. I'm not sure if we were able to capture anything in the individual differences. Now we go to what we thought were our most possibly interesting, but at least literal question. Would you go to the clinic if it made the first sound like the second? And then we also tried to add into this one a deficit version. So we play the advantageous one first, and then the second one is like, would it make the second sound as clear as the first? This didn't work as well, but we actually were able to corroborate these results. And doing all this took quite a bit of time. It took almost 2 hours for some people to complete all this, because we wanted to get as much delta SNR as both positive and negative. But what I want you to notice here is a couple of things. There's one, we have much more of this sort of slow, gradual liftoff from basically no response. And we don't get, once again, we don't get to above chance. It's a well into 6 dB for the lower reference SNRs, and then we don't even actually get significantly above chance at the highest SNR we tested. For the low ones, there isn't much difference, but there also isn't as a dramatic leap forward for the highest ones. So there's this interaction, as we call it, for these conditions between the negative and the positive. Now the issue here, and it's an issue we've had through some of these as we present this to people, and we often get people who can don't really get the sort of paradigm we're after. And here we had 27 actual people in, but 6 of them could simply not get the thing. Or as Kevin mentioned to, they didn't get it. And that was the issue. But once again, just point out here, so would you go to the clinic or not? 3 dB SNR, 1 or 2 dB SNR, there's just nothing there. People are not finding that worthwhile, even though often in the hearing aid circles we fight for every decibel of gain we can get in the speech reception special performance. It's just not registering with these folks, and these are the ones that cannot get it. So that was a bit difficult, and we had that rather high attrition rate. So let's simplify it. So now we just do 5 different delta SNRs. We brought in 34 different folk. And what we find, perhaps, it looks a bit more positive. These numbers are a bit, just a touch higher, but not significantly so, than the results from the previous group. But we see this, there's no real difference here, and then we start to see the movement, and then people's responses getting above chance, where you be convinced that they would say yes, don't rise into 6 or 8 dB. So over and over again now, we see that these, what we might call meaningful, and what we're trying to purport here as being a meaningful SNR change, does not happen until about 6 or 8 dB. Now, in this, we had also, since we were given enough more time by limiting the number of conditions here, we were able to collect SNR JNDs, even though we pretty well established a 3 dB SNR JND. Sure enough, we found the group mean here to also be right around 3 dB. We were able to compare the two of them. And what we found was initially that those who had really poor SNR JNDs showed much less willingness than those with lower SNR JNDs. And this makes sense. If someone is having trouble detecting that difference, given our paradigm, they're probably not going to ascribe any value to it. Makes sense. But as we went on and we collected 34 data points, what we found is that only applies if you look at basically those whose fixed level SNR JND results didn't approach 79%. And those people did not ascribe any value to it. The rest of them, there was no real correlation. So it's very, a bit frustrating once again in the fact that we're not finding the what's at play here. Although it is true that the 3 dB SNR JND doesn't seem to be, it seems to be where there starts to be a shift. 1, 2 are basically on top of each other in terms of the mean responses. It starts to grow. But the relationship, maybe this is one of those experiments where a large N is required, because the scatter looks to be, but then you start running the statistics on it and you go, oh, it's not there. So, being an honest Abe, no mustache, I'd like to say, anyone? No? Abe Lincoln? No? I didn't bring the hat, I'm sorry. So, being a bit honest, we can't really say that there is a correlation, even though I could start talking about there's trends, there's this, there's that. It's not there at this point. Although if we do this sort of what's called sometimes a median split, but not take a median, but take those who just have really poor results on SNR JND and do a grouping, we do see these sorts of effects. Those who cannot detect don't ascribe any value. All right. Need to move it on. The last thing was a rating. How much better or worse was the second compared to the first? Very simple. Just used kind of standard 11-point scale. Some people like to call them Likert. Others don't. -5 to much better, +5 is how we had to scale. So much worse was the anchor, and much better. We randomized the order on a trial basis, which we couldn't do before, which was quite nice, because you'd like to do that for proper psychophysics. And we just used a single SNR reference just to keep things simple, because we noticed the longer people were stuck in the booth listening to these things, the more of them couldn't get it. What we found here is actually, once again, part of the same story of 1 and 2 dB. I'll let you know. But we find that actually by 4 dB SNR, there is, when the second one is better, a significant increase in finding that, oh, that one did sound better. So there is this lowering of it. When you go away from that, oh, would you go to the clinic for that? Would you swap? Would you do something for this? That obviously adds in, it adds in some noise, as we've seen, but it also adds in this sense of burden. And I don't know if you've heard recently, but a lot of people are applying economic models in hearing aids, in the hearing aid provision. where they talk about net benefit. And you have the benefit of the hearing aid, and then you have its burden. And often then that goes into something like a bilateral fitting, where you think, oh, there's a benefit to putting on the second hearing aid if that ear could use amplification. But sometimes people look at that and they say, there's a bit of a burden there, and they don't perceive that extra benefit. And so what you get is you have the net benefit, it comes up, and then as you get towards the peak of the benefit, it actually tapers back down because they feel there's a burden there. So the net benefit actually comes back down around. Whereas here, we see this start to rise up actually earlier than in our previous studies. And another thing to notice, for all you statisticians and stats lovers out there, these are within subject confidence intervals within computing, because of these have all been repeated measure designs, is these are much smaller than our others. We get a lot of variance across people. You'd expect, if you're asking them, would you go to the clinic? People bring a lot of baggage to that question. And so that shows up, there's a lot of noise. Here, we're just asking, is it better or worse? They start to agree. And the second thing I want to bring up is what's hopefully striking is the difference between presenting a better situation and then showing one that has gotten worse. And the fact is the fact that people are actually, even for Glasgow, rather positive. They start thinking things are much better, but they don't move that scale over or don't select over towards the much worse. It's not getting that much worse, it's not getting much better. It's something we're still trying to process what that exactly means for our previous work on this, but it does show that there is clearly this asymmetric value applied to these situations. Good. So that's the results we have. And in just got a few minutes, I want to throw out at you all, since now you're all experts on that and know as much as I do. Most of you probably know more. We're going to try to take this, and right now it's sort of a step backward, but one of the issues has been when we're using these sentences, male talker sentences, in a speech spectrum noise. And one of the things about speech intelligibility is if you change the SNR, people will get better gradually, to a certain extent. We're going to talk about the psychometric function, how they get better. And what's interesting is the fact that it actually can change based on the corpus you use. It's often thought that digits, singles or triples, in a broadband noise will give you a very steep function. What that means is basically, I don't get it, I get it. You hear all of it or you hear none of it, sort of thing. Whereas you have something like that, it was like, you know, was it my shoe fits Tom Hanks or was it the birch canoe slid on smooth planks? I'm not sure. And you gradually, anybody? That's the IEEE sentences. List 1, sentence 1. Yeah. Thank you very much. Great thing. So, but the trick here is what we need to do is we need to measure so it's percent correct, and then try to look at the SNR J and D based on that. Because the question, this has come up when I've presented this to other audiences, is the idea is this a 3 dB SNR J and D that we were talking about in the first half, or is it actually the equivalent percent correct that we're dealing with? We are asking people, is this clear? So, is it, if we try these different speech and different noises, and which have these different functions, whether steep or relatively shallow, would we find that the SNR J and D corresponds to 3 dB across both of them, this and this point? Or does it actually correspond to, say, 30%, which would actually be, for the digits, a 1 dB SNR J and D versus the 3 dB for the sentences? So that's where we're thinking about right now. I appreciate it if anyone has any feedback on why that would be not worthwhile, or go forward, move ahead. And then there's the issue I brought from the start about the idea of how you measure SNR and how we perceive SNR. Do we perceive it in these glimpses? do we perceive these variations? Do we take into account when those aren't there? Or up to, say, you know, this time scale of a sentence that these IEEE sentences go from, I think, like 1.6 to 3 seconds in length, pretty well constrained. Is that basically one worthwhile blend, or does this affect it? And then, even in the much longer term, what I've been talking about is more of the wow, what's demonstrable in the short term. If we know that there is benefits you can measure for speech reception of 1 or 2 dB, and this is a benefit. In the long run, can we actually stretch this out to try to see if there's any of this meaningfulness that we've been trying to ascribe to more, say, continuous speech and noise situations? And look at the longer. The real trick there is, if you start playing something in a longer example, they'll base everything either on the start or the end. The middle never really matters. That's often the case in sound quality. So we could try to use a continuous sort of method that they judge along, but we're still trying to figure out and hash out how to tackle these issues currently. And I just want to summarize very quickly that the SNR-JD we found is about 3 dB for our given situation, but the meaningful change in SNR is around 6 to 8 decibels. This is that demonstrable benefit. It's separate from that sort of performance benefit that someone would get. Yes, you're performing better, but if you actually tried to show them in a simple demonstration, they probably wouldn't be wowed by it. And this actually could provide a benchmark for noise reduction schemes, especially with new hearing aid users or trying to get people to adapt and maybe even use the program button, which they very often don't like to do. You find that maybe you need to have much better techniques for changing the signal-to-noise ratio. Caveats, always caveats. This was in the lab. There's definitely something for someone sitting in a chair in a booth that could possibly basically change their position, their feelings towards the what would they would describe meaning, as opposed to when they have gone through the stages to actually go and seek out an intervention. You'd expect there'd probably be a bit more positivity there. And given the stimuli we used in the setup, is this applicable to the real world? And there's our reasons to suspect, given the fact that someone who actually go out and seek a hearing aid, that they might find more meaning with less changes in SNR. These could be overestimates, but as I've discussed previously, there might be chances that these are actually underestimates, and that you'd actually even need more. And to go to an algorithm engineer and say, I need 10 dB SNR change, well, that would be the end of your friendship. Thank you very much.
That was perfect. Thank you. Okay, so we have a chance for questions and discussions. The hands are going up. And Michael and then Kai.
When you've been doing the SNR measure, you've been talking about 50%, usually the slope around the 50% point. And you know, the question comes, how many people are willing to operate in an environment when they're only getting 50% right? And therefore, is it worth also sort of doing those sorts of estimates for something like more realistic, like if you were, say, getting 80% right, which is maybe where you are in the pub, where you're happy in that, and between the sort of let's go and find a quiet corner somewhere, or
yeah, it's a fair point, yeah. It's interesting that we did the first set of tests at people's SRT. I think I neglected to mention that. Mm-hmm. So we took a measure of their SRT and started there, and looked at an increase from there. So yeah, that is that 50% and up, and that's why I put that as the model for where we'd go next. But it is true that we could go from here instead of starting at 50, start a bit north of that and actually look at that and look at how that varies. But you're talking more than subjective reports. That's an interesting point. Yeah.
Well, we used an argument on that one for looking at masking release, just saying that actually 50% most people, we only saw a masking release in one condition at 50%, and when you were up at 80% there was no masking release, and therefore in terms of what people are possibly really operating at, do you ever actually observe it? Because you can pay your subjects to sit in 50%, but most people leave the pub.
Willingness to be in there, yeah. And so it actually, and that could be a way that these actually are sort of overestimates and stuff like that, because if they're actually performing it. But the interesting thing is, when it was at that more advantageous SNR, they ascribed less meaning to it. So that was the thing, that the changes actually didn't matter as much, which makes sense. And so that was the thing. So it actually, the meaningful sort of threshold would actually probably increase. If that makes sense, because which makes fits in. But that's a very good point.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for this talk. I thought it was very fascinating and really extremely, applicable and clinically useful. Now, I would like to sort of follow on from what you actually said yourself about the caveats of this study. And I'm sort of thinking, if we're really talking about clinically meaningful, then at the end of the day, I would imagine we are interested in how whatever things are changing are helping this person communicate. And I'm wondering whether you are maybe in the future interested in sort of increasing the difficulty level of your studies, that by trying to find out how these changes in signal-to-noise ratio help the patients when they can actually lip read. Because I have had a lot of to do with patients who really have extremely bad speech perception because of neurological disease, and for them lip reading is very, very important, and then improving signal-to-noise ratio obviously improves the situation. So combination of real life situation, is it something that
that's very interesting, because it's a very curious idea, because we think of the visual input as being the great leveler for performance, the classic Sumbian-Pollack graph that you have, performance going up as a function of SNR, but with visual stimulus it fills in, and so people are preaching the ceiling. Although I think recently Wu and Bentler have shown that the ceiling drops for older individual, as we age and with hearing impairments, as to how much benefit they can get. But it's very it's very interesting to see how that would interact, the visual information and the meaning ascribed to it, and along, of course, with that person's ability. Because I think it was Charlie Watson tried one of the those kitchen sink approaches, trying to relate speech perception to all of these modulation, pure tone thresholds, all of these thresholds. Found stuff to, and then he said, "Oh, let's try their lip reading." Absolute match, boom, like that. It was like this very clear cut based on what the type of speech thresholds they were measuring, how it fit very nicely with that. And it goes to your point exactly. That'd be very interesting. Thanks.
Did you ask your patients at all, at any point of the design of the study, what could be meaningful benefits to them? So you had some meaningful benefits, but did you actually ask, were there any other things that could be meaningful to a patient?
Right.
Sorry, let me just do this. So what I was going to ask was related to that. It was things like, for some people, intelligibility is important. For others, it might be comfort.
Oh, sure.
So just noticeable.
Absolutely. That goes into a thing. We have asked that in not in this project, but in other projects. We've in Glasgow been looking at that sort of stuff. But that's the whole. Let me think here. Almost lost my train of thought. Wait, get back on the track.
I didn't get what you mean. That's probably throwing you more.
But no, the whole idea of what was meaningful is the whole idea of the speech. We were trying to focus it and control it to that point of being about the intelligibility gains, because of the focus on that within the sort of coming from that sort of myopic hearing aid device sort of point of view. But the comfort thing and what you're talking about, what matters to them, if you look at gain, because we know just adjusting the gain sometimes can have this dramatic impact. And still, that's still through that, you know, device view, but then what matters to them in terms of the communication being restored, and what matters to them, and like the comfort and the things like that. Yeah, these seem to be things to branch out and start to look at as well, from this sort of idea of using this sort of taking psychophysical methods, but then applying the subjective report. Because often they exist, to me, as islands where you have the, a fine example of the SSQ, where you put people in these situations. And we've run that along with the GHAB, thousands of people on this. And even though it seems to us, oh yes, you read that, you know what that example's about. How many people are confused by even, you know, the 4 scenarios of the GHAB? What's that about? In front of the TV? Wait, so I'm behind the TV? No! You're listening to the TV. You don't, that sort of thing. You get these sort of issues. And then you have the other side where it's just like, all right, boop, 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 boop. You know, get the score, see what they can detect, and that's it. And then you try to take that and merge this, and there's a great chasm between those two. And that's what this is trying to get at. And so, yeah, and it hopefully will spread a bit over to that side of trying to get that as well. Thanks.
So let me wrap this up. Thanks again to Oticon for sponsoring the event. Thank you to you for coming along. I'm trying to count. I think there's like 46 here, so that we have a target to aim for. See if we can get better than 46. This is the biggest this year, I think, is it? 46. So you currently have the record. And thank you to you for coming along.
Oh, thanks so much.